The development of civilization is very closely related to the emergence of new materials. And often, these materials changed human life so much that entire eras from the early history of the development of civilization were even named after them. First, there was the Stone Age, then the Bronze Age, and after it, the Iron Age. Nevertheless, there are also many examples in history when, despite the obvious advantages of new materials, humanity was in no hurry to launch them into widespread production due to the high cost of producing this material. Let's take steel. Although the technology of steel production itself has been known for several millennia, due to the high cost of production until the 19th century, it was produced in small quantities and only for the production of expensive items, such as weapons. Here we can recall that the famous cold steel weapons made of Damascus steel were sold for their weight in gold, and only very wealthy nobles could afford such weapons. And everything changed when the Briton Henry Bessemer in 1856 accidentally discovered a process for removing excess carbon impurities and by which cast iron was turned into steel. The revolutionary nature of this method was that this process allowed to significantly reduce the cost of steel production, from 40 to 7 pounds per ton. And then this cheaper production allowed steel to be used where it was previously economically impractical. This further led to an increase in demand and which created the prerequisites for large-scale industrial production, which in itself also led to a decrease in the price of steel and an expansion of the use of this steel. In general, the importance of the revolution that cheap steel brought about is very difficult to overestimate. What is worth only one historical episode? The beginning of the Civil War in the United States is considered to be the attack of the Confederates on the naval Fort Sumter, and not being able to evacuate one of the ships called Merrimack, the command of the fort decided to sink it so that it would not reach the enemy side. And after the Confederates captured this fort, and then they did not have their own shipbuilding, they decided to raise this sunken ship. In general, it was no longer a ship, but rather the remains of a ship. Nevertheless, having examined and seen that important elements of this ship had survived, the Confederates decided to sheath it with steel sheets and turn it into an ironclad, and the ship itself was named Virginia. This experiment turned out to be so successful that it literally immediately changed the situation on the battlefield, because no weapons of that time could do anything with the armor of this ship. Cannonballs that hit the hull simply bounced off it, without causing any harm to it. Therefore, in order to somehow confront this new threat, the Union was forced to create its own ironclad, the Monitor. And soon, these two ships would meet in a battle that would become known as the First Battle of Ironclads. Steel made no less revolution in the civilian sector. At first, it was a railway. After all, at that time the rails were made of cast iron, but due to the very fragility of the material, these rails were constantly destroyed and deformed. And therefore the owners of the railway were looking for some more durable material. Also, later steel would begin to be widely used in the construction of skyscrapers, bridges, and other infrastructure. Moreover, a very large role in such a wide use of steel was played by the further reduction in the cost of production. And probably the greatest contribution to such a reduction was made by the entrepreneur Andrew Carnegie. Here it must be said right away that although Bessemer himself was the owner of this technology, which he also patented, he then sold licenses for this technology. So one of the first entrepreneurs who purchased this license was Alfred Krupp, who would later become the largest arms manufacturer in Germany. And in 1872, Bessemer met Andrew Carnegie, who had made his fortune on railways. And although at that time there were already several steel mills in the USA that worked on Bessemer technology, Carnegie understood what he was getting into. When he still worked on the railroad, he remembered very well the poor quality of cast iron rails. And considering that he was closely acquainted with the management of the Pennsylvania Railroad, where he had previously built a career, and he was also known in other companies, so he decided to become the main supplier of steel for the railroad industry. Of course, not everything went as planned. After all, at that time, the rapid growth of railways was often ended by bankruptcies, which in turn significantly affected demand in the industry. However, Carnegie had his own strategy. While other manufacturers built small factories, he understood that the main secret of success was the constant search for ways to reduce production costs. And to achieve this goal, he saw several ways. The first is scaling, when the cost can be reduced due to the effect of scale. He saw the importance of this effect on the railway, when operating costs per unit of cargo decreased due to an increase in the volume of transportation itself. And Carnegie set himself the goal of building the largest factories that would help achieve better savings than his competitors. The second method was to keep wages low for workers, which is why strikes constantly occurred at his factories. The third method was constant modernization. That is, he paid little to his workers, but at the same time spent a lot on expanding and modernizing production. So he built a plant to produce steel using the Siemens-Martin technology, which allowed him to produce better quality but slightly more expensive steel. At the same time, within the framework of one business, this was a strategy that justified itself because he could subsidize the less profitable open hearth process with the more profitable Bessemer process, which significantly expanded his sales market. And the last method was vertical integration, when he also took control of the mining of iron ore and the production of coke. And thanks to this mania for reducing costs, he actually made his own steel so cheap that other manufacturers could not compete with him. And while others suffered from a shortage of orders, his factories were always loaded with orders. And thanks to this, by 1900, he would become the largest steel producer in the United States, and his plants would smelt more steel than the whole of Great Britain. And a year later, he would sell this business to banker John Morgan, who then began building his steel empire, U.S. Steel.